Unhinged marketing. Why does it work so well in the 2020s? Is its efficacy starting to wane a little bit? And will we ever be able to put the hinges back on? Happy Friday, Carnies, and welcome back to the Daily Carnage Show. I'm Shannon. I'm a digital marketing strategist at Carney, and I'm your host. So grab your coffee and let's get started. Where do I start? If you would have told me back in 2011 when I was working as an intern, registering and building some of the very first social media accounts for brands, that one day Wendy's would tweet, "Can we send her back?" in response to Katy Perry going to space. I would have a lot of questions, but my first reaction would be, who's the intern that got fired? Because it really was the case that back then, when millennials were interns still in college or entry-level marketers who had just graduated, we were often tasked with not just running the social media accounts for brands and doing community management and content, but also just doing all of the driving behind the strategy. We were subject matter experts on social media, often by way of just being young. We were being hired by Gen X and boomers who had been hearing for the last 15 years that millennials were digital natives. And so when it came time for brands to have company pages, everybody in the room kind of turned and looked at us and said, "You know how to do that, right?" And I was one such lucky millennial who had to go home and explain to my parents that I was tweeting as Paula Deen for a living, just like I had always dreamed since I was a wee girl. But okay, so what happened during that time with all these young millennials in their first professional roles was highly predictable. People accidentally tweeted as brands, thinking that they were signed into their personal accounts. I think back then we often linked all of our profiles and things, so it was super precarious. And the intern would catch it and delete it, but not before the internet caused a complete ruckus. And this is sort of the birth of the fire the intern meme. And interns have been messing things up since forever. But this really felt like the first moment in history where they had all the nuclear codes. It is just unfathomable to me today when people are like, "Oh, the intern tweeted something crazy." Because I'm like, baby, the intern does not have the credentials anymore. This is the 2020s. There's a lot of approval processes built in now, but we still think of it in these outdated retro terms. The intern with the Twitter account on their personal phone. But why am I sharing all of this? Well, unhinged marketing is very interesting to me because I think if we can look at it through the lens of any other artistic or cultural movement, I think we can start to understand some of the direct and indirect lineage and tradition that it comes from. And we can answer the question of why it can only work in this moment as we sort of wonder what's next. So let's start with an easy definition. Unhinged marketing, as you know, is marked by chaos, this sort of surreal humor, classic irony, a real cynicism and self-deprecation. And when we're talking about brands, we're talking about unpredictable behavior. It is, on the surface level, a 2020s fad. We can start to see it bubbling up around Y2K. I think specifically of campaigns from Skittles and Old Spice. Notably, this is right around the time where brands are making their first company pages and social media profiles. And this is important to note because it's part of a tradition of brands moving closer and closer to a sort of unified persona. They have a Facebook page just like you. In some ways, they're an individual which you can communicate with, but more importantly, identify with and relate to. Suddenly, it's a two-way street. And this is also a function of American politics really priming the stage by giving corporations more rights as individuals. So by the time we make it to 2018, when Wendy's begins roasting other people and other brands on Twitter, it's unexpected, it's original, but it's also exceptionally of the moment. It speaks to the expectations and the circumstances of the audience. Things have just sort of devolved since then. In really every way imaginable. And if I sometimes sound cynical to you, it's because I'm trafficking in the language and the sensibility of a millennial marketer in 2025. So unhinged marketing isn't just a fad. It has a tradition. It's rooted in postmodern aesthetics. It's accelerated by digital media and AI. It's fueled by widespread cynicism. And it resonates now because it mirrors the absurdity and all of the contradictions of contemporary life. So what do I mean when I say postmodernism? It's a movement that starts in the mid to late 20th century, and it's a direct reaction to modernism. And it's characterized by a few tenets: skepticism toward certainty and authority, a welcoming of contradiction and irony and paradox, a blurring of boundaries between high and low culture. There's a breaking down of the idea of originality. There's a spirit of playfulness and self-referential work in media. There's a lot of nostalgia. There's a lot of pulling pulling from different decades and creating something new, but it's really the origins of this meta humor or self-parody. Postmodernism is the idea that there's not a single universal truth. There's only fragments and irony and constant remixing. And if this sounds exactly like TikTok to you, it's because we are now living in a sort of digital postmodernism where everything is constantly memeified and recontextualized. It's been called the post-truth era. The 2020s have undoubtedly been shaped by a lot of global crises. There's climate anxiety, political instability, pandemic trauma, and economic precarity. Camus said that the absurd arises when humans search for meaning in a chaotic world. And it's certainly true that there's never been a time in history where we've had more access to a barrage of information, visual and audio stimuli, with exposure to so many parallel realities and perspectives. It can kind of feel like everything is true and nothing is true all at once. It can feel like the only reasonable way forward is to deconstruct truth. And I realize this is a pretty charitable reading of meme culture, but you just have to trust me. People have written entire dissertations and books about this. When we talk about Gen Z and Gen Alpha in particular being really attracted to the absurd, to the surreal, to the Dadaist sensibility that we see in things like brain rot language online, short form video across places like TikTok and YouTube Shorts, or even these sort of absurd world building ironic video games. What we're really talking about is a coping mechanism, and a valid one. It's a rational way to respond to a world that feels irrational and nonsensical. Surrealism begins in 1924 as a rational emotional response to World War I, and not 100 years later, it's dominant in our media, our art, our advertising. And that's because it's spooky scary time again. We don't get Moon Pie tweeting, "Okay, baby," without cultural unrest and skepticism. You're probably a marketer. I don't have to tell you that public trust in institutions and brands as institutions, governments, media, corporations has steadily declined. But as a result, audiences are deeply skeptical of anything hyper-polished, overly scripted, what feels like disingenuous brand messaging. Like everything, people have a lot more insight now into how business works. They know all your PR tricks, and they know they're getting version 27 of the public apology. They don't care. We don't care. Enter unhinged marketing, which completely subverts this by breaking the fourth wall. Oh, you're gonna mock our apology tweet on Twitter? Cool. We're gonna mock ourselves. We're gonna mock marketing. We're going to make a mockery of marketing for your entertainment because we noticed that you really engage with that content. We collectively recognize that the terms of capitalism are kind of inescapable, but we can reclaim some of that agency and kind of mock its mechanisms. And it works because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Platforms like TikTok and X and Reddit, they all reward immediacy, imperfection, and relatability. They are ripe for the anti-ad campaign. Traditional ad campaigns feel totally alien and out of place on a place like TikTok. You know, it was a lot easier to publish these perfectly polished assets in a strategic cadence when social platforms had chronological timelines. In order for a campaign to feel native to a platform like TikTok, it has to be unhinged. It has to traffic in meme formats. It has to parody internet culture back to itself. And often it has to appear to lose control, giving the reins to a careless intern, descending into surreal madness. And this is important. It's not necessarily because audiences believe in the narrative or the character. It's simply because they enjoy the performance. It's just sort of a shared cultural wink. It's like, hey, it's absurd that you have so many higher education degrees, but you can't find a job. It's absurd to be scrolling your For You page and see the cutest animal do something adorable in 1 second, and then the next see unimaginable violence. And it's not a stretch. I think there is something incredibly soothing about seeing a brand like Nutter Butter pop the F off.
What's wrong, sweetheart?
You It's like, hell yeah. While we're on the topic of Nutter Butter, when they started doing their thing like a year ago, it was like the first time I saw a lot of millennials be like, hey, maybe this part of the internet isn't for me anymore. And I remember some of the discussion on places like LinkedIn was like, hey, Nutter Butter is alienating a significant part of their audience, which I guess they meant is like people who aren't 11 years old, but it worked. And the reason it worked is because of that fragmentation that we talked about with postmodernism, the fragmentation of identity. The internet will always reward a niche. It will always privilege highly specific micro communities with their own languages, their own aesthetics, their own memes. And so in some ways, communicating to a mass market on the internet feels insane. It's irrelevant. Just pick a lane and do it well. Yeah, like Nutter Butter could throw up a pretty wholesome commercial cut vertically for TikTok. But why? What's the point? You're here. You might as well speak the language. No one's like at the supermarket being like, I'm not going to buy this Nutter Butter because I don't know what the hell they're talking about on TikTok. It was just a good bet. It worked out for them. They understood the moment and the assignment. Brands that lean into this specificity, give into the chaos a little bit, they connect with these niche internet subcultures. And guess what? Those are the people that engage. And when that happens, the algorithms smile upon you. If you're critical of unhinged marketing as a tactic, if you're tired of it, totally valid. But I do think it's a little lazy not to acknowledge that it doesn't come from nowhere. But we're responsible thinkers here, so let's take a minute to talk about the problem. If everyone is unhinged, is anyone unhinged? Is it now more unhinged to be hinged? Has the counterculture become dominant? And if so, is it now waning? And if so, what's next? So recently, Sprout published its Q2 2025 Pulse survey. And some of the data seems to suggest that when it comes to unhinged marketing, people don't necessarily relate most to the loudest brand on the internet, or even the funniest or the trendiest with the hottest takes. Based on the data, it appears that what makes a brand stand out is honesty. Brands that seem to be communicating from an authentic persona, like say Duolingo. Brands that really own the weirdness across all of the touch points, not just social. And this is sort of in line with a larger trend. Philosophers believe that we're in a sort of messy transitional period between postmodernism and whatever comes next. People are rapidly cycling between irony and honesty, between hope and cynicism. That's the thing about cynicism, is that it becomes tiresome and boring. And it's really interesting that we're kind of warming to this idea of authenticity and honesty at the same time that generative AI enters the chat. Literally. And so, if I may, I would safely forecast that brands that differentiate themselves from heavy use of AI, brands that lean into vulnerability and sincerity, may start to see more success as the 2020s come to an end. Everything is just culture, counterculture, action, reaction. And if the algorithms reward the unexpected, it looks like we're going to have to put the hinges back on.
What's wrong, sweetheart?
As always, I would love to know your thoughts on this topic. Feel free to @ me, hey, it's not that deep. I don't know if you can tell, but I get that a lot. It's really important to me to drop marketing and advertising into a larger social context. Our industry doesn't only reflect and react to culture, but as we know historically, marketing and advertising creates culture. And so adding the sociological lens on top of it, it just makes everything make more sense. But you've waited long enough. It is finally time for an ad from the past. And in keeping with today's theme, we have a campaign poster that was made for Shell, the oil company, in the 1930s by an artist named Hans Schleger. At the time, he was a really popular graphic designer, schooled in Germany in the 1920s during the height of surrealism, and he worked at several ad agencies in Berlin and New York before settling down in London in 1932. He worked under the pseudonym Zero, and he was commissioned to make this poster for Shell at a time when they were conducting an extensive publicity campaign by commissioning young artists to improve brand sentiment. They were trafficking in the memes of the time, and this poster says, "These men use Shell. You can be sure of Shell." And in the image, we see a massive floating male head hovering over a strip of newsprint. In the foreground, there's an extremely large pencil. There are clouds all around his head. And in the distance, around the horizon, we see two figures who seem to be approaching. The man notably has no discernible eyeballs. But still, he has sort of an incredulous expression on his face. It's definitely invoking heaven, God, but it's also directly calling back to Rene Magritte's use of clouds. The juxtaposition and the contrast of scale and this disembodied head create a lot of anxiety in the viewer. This is classic surrealist imagery. It has a nightmarish quality, but something that is unexplainably attractive and magnetic because it reflects to you your own anxieties. There's a lot of humor here that might be lost on modern audiences. You know, it's 1938 in Europe, but you can be sure of Shell. Wow, I had so much fun today. And that wraps it up this week for the Daily Carnage Show. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, I'd love it if you rated our show, liked and subscribed across all our socials, and never forget to subscribe to the Daily Carnage newsletter, where we talk about stuff like this every day of the work week. We're also chatting about all things marketing on our exclusive Facebook community. But until next week, I will see you in the inbox. Have a good weekend, Carnies.